Hey folks, welcome back to Only the Best Fantasy Novels. My name is Robin, and today I want to talk about a book I suspect has a very strong chance of appearing on many a top 10 list at the end of this year, and it's Once Was Willem by M.R. Carey. It's a strong contender. It's a strong contender. Anyway, what is this book about? It's a fantasy, horror, historical fiction mashup that is roughly set in the 1100s in rural England when a wizard comes to town. And this is a wizard who has his own mysterious agenda. But anyway, where the story takes a twist is that a year before the wizard comes to this town, a boy named Willem died. And in their grief and their desperation, when the wizard appears 1 year later, the parents go to him to ask for the boy to be brought back to life. But once again, the wizard is up to his own thing, and what returns is certainly not what the parents hope for, and everything just goes downhill from there. So, yeah, like this book is cool. Okay, it's very much a standalone. The story very much begins and ends in this one book, but there is serious potential. There is serious potential. M.R. Carey does a brilliant job of just mixing so many different elements of competence into this story that there's quite a lot to unpack in here. So it has a heavy historical fiction influence in that obviously it's set in 1100s rural England, and we do have some elements of that. We actually get to see we actually get references to certain historical events that take place, certain key historical events that kind of allow us to kind of place where roughly this time span in which is the events of this book do occur, but not to like definitively pinpoint it, but close enough. So there's that. There's a fantasy element to it, obviously, because we have a sorcerer who is up to certain shenanigans. But by far, after the historical fiction component, the heaviest component of this book is horror. Because make no mistake, this is very horrific. This book can get very horrific. So obviously we have this main character who's a revenant, and it's a first-person story that takes place very much. We get Willem's narration of the events that occur after his resurrection and the conflict that the village becomes embroiled in. As a result, we get his first-hand take on it, and one of the things that I really enjoyed about it is that M.R. Carey does just a really good job of giving us the feel and the vibe of this time, like with the way Willem thinks, the way he puts down the actual prose, the way Willem actually narrates this story to himself, it has that archaic feel to it. Yeah, obviously it's not historically accurate, but it does kind of evoke that feel. So you can actually think to the dialogue of a show like Game of Thrones, and that'll give you an idea of the vibe in which the story is narrated to us, the reader. And it's not just a straightforward narration. Willem will frequently, as he includes scenes that don't necessarily seem to fit or have a part or have a role to play in the story as yet, Willem will constantly interject and break the fourth wall and tell us, "Don't worry, this is relevant. You'll see why later," that kind of thing. And the events that he talks about can get pretty horrific, and it's horror that it ranges a gamut. Like there's different types of horror, and we see quite a bit of different types over the course of this novel. Like obviously there's the fear and the closed-mindedness of the villagers when something like Willem returns to try to live among them. There is the weird and strange as the sorcerer begins to enact his own maybe not even agenda, we should say, and the things that start to occur as a result of that, and the things that start to appear as a result of that. There's horror surrounding some of the larger events that happened that early on, with regards to the political structure of this location. You can see, like the villagers do make some choices that are dark and very unforgiving, and then the horror can also get strange, because this is very much a story that has a religious tinge, a religious tinge to it, I should say, with the inclusion of one particular character and the way that their powers kind of work, and how that eventually takes place, how that eventually incorporates into the story. And then it can get like the horror can get everywhere from emotional to body horror to grotesque to weird to even maybe more paranormal, I could say, that kind of thing. Like it ranges the gamut, and it's included in ways to make the story interesting and compelling and weird and engaging. And speaking of engaging, I can't really help but think about the cast of characters. Like this is very much a novel where like we have characters who are initially introduced, and as the story unfolds and they face challenges and conflicts and these kind of things, it forces them to make concessions or challenge their beliefs, or challenge the things that challenge their morality, basically. And as is typical with most monster stories, it does play with the whole idea of who is actually the monster in the story. That is very much a part of it. But another part of it is that the characters who do take part in this story, they're pretty varied, and they each have their own shtick, and that's where things get really interesting, because it draws on religious inspirations. The characters draw on folkloric inspirations and these kind of things, and you just have this weird mashup. Like it's almost cinematic in the way that entire thing plays out. It's almost like one of the comparisons that came to mind for me, in not necessarily a cool way, is just like a similar situation is the way in the first Avengers movie, when they finally band together to deal with the Chitauri invasion. That's kind of how this book felt at one point, when the characters finally come together to deal with the conflict. Obviously, each character has their own agenda. Some are more antagonistic, some are more friendly, some have their own thing going on. That kind of thing, and they each find ways to work and complement each other in different ways. As for how the actual story unfolds, it starts as a slow burn as we get introduced to the setting, the whole situation surrounding Willem and his eventual return and so. And then from there, and also how the way that the political landscape of this little rural area, the way it changes, and the results of that. So all of that is pretty much a decent setup. But then from there, the story begins to like ramp up from a slow burn into a more action-packed kind of feel, as the characters who are the protagonists in this particular thing, they finally start to take part in the conflict, and from there it just kind of keeps escalating. Like I said, the word that keeps coming back to me is very cinematic. Like this book feels almost like it could be a movie. Or it could be almost like the script of a movie, in just the way that things play out. So, just the particular way in which things play out. But yeah, all in all, a fun read, an ultimately fun read. It has quite a few interesting ideas and things that it does. It combines so many different unique elements and it combines so many different unique elements and concepts and ideas to create something that is clearly meant to be like just a almost light-hearted fun read, while at the same time giving you quite a bit of meat to chew on. Because the story, like the actual events that the story portrays, they can be dark, they can be terrible, they can be horrific. You would never want to be anywhere near anything of this sort that's happening, but at the same time, the way that they play out, there's in some situations, there's almost a lack of gravitas, and in the others, you're dealing with some pretty dark stuff. Like I don't really want to get into spoilers, but if you don't like seeing things happen to children, maybe don't read this book. But yeah, all in all, a really cool read. I can easily see this being, like I said, I can easily see this being in a few people's top 10s. It's certainly one of the more fun books I've read this year. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about Once Is Willem. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.